You're all very welcome, and thank you for coming here to hear our Teatime Talk this evening, the title of which is Thomas Bryan, One of the Forgotten 10. Teatime Talks are a series of talks inspired by the 14 Henrietta Street, which is a social history museum. The talks are inspired by various topics around the street and around the house. And Henrietta Street, 14 Henrietta Street, is a social history museum that's run by the Dublin City Council Culture Company, which run a number of buildings and a series of events and initiatives across the city of Dublin with and for the people of Dublin. My name is Fergus Whelan, and in a few minutes I'm going to hand you over to tonight's speaker. But before I start, I want to let you know that you will get an opportunity to ask questions, but the way you will ask those questions is through the Q&A box. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A box there. Any question you have, type it in there, and we will endeavour to answer as many questions as we can. Now, bear in mind that this talk has been recorded, and we will share this with you at a later date on one of our channels. If you want to be told when this is available and find out more about our other projects and events, please sign up for a newsletter. I will put a link for that into the chat during the course of the talk. Our speaker this evening is Colin Ring. Colin is a tour guide in 14 Henrietta Street and at Richmond Barracks. He's also a Fáilte Ireland national tour guide and gives historical bicycle tours of Dublin City and of the Phoenix Park. So without further ado, over to you, Colin.
So, good morning, Fergus. Agus Fáilte Galéir, and welcome to our Teatime Talk today. So, our talk today is on Thomas Bryan, and Thomas has connections to 14 Henrietta Street, and he was executed 100 years ago on the 14th of March 1921 for his involvement in the IRA during the War of Independence. So Thomas Bryan is one of the so-called Forgotten 10 who were executed around the same time as Kevin Barry. So we all know Kevin Barry, and he's well known through song and story and history. But the others lay unremembered in the grounds of Mountjoy Prison until they were reinterred with full state honours in the Republican plot in Glasnevin Cemetery in 2001. And although the 10 were forgotten by the public, they certainly weren't forgotten by their families and their supporters, and we'll see that later on in the talk. So Thomas Bryan's story is of an ordinary man, an ordinary Dublin man from an ordinary Dublin family, caught up in these momentous events of early 20th century revolutionary Ireland. And his story is, I suppose, is both heroic and tragic in equal measure, as we'll see as well. These are the Forgotten 10. So the Forgotten 10 are Kevin Barry, Patrick Moran, Frank Flood, Thomas Whelan, Thomas Traynor, Patrick Doyle, Edmond Foley, Bernard Ryan, Patrick Maher, and our own Thomas Bryan. So before we get into the story of Thomas Bryan, we're going to have a little look about where he came from and the area that he came from, and a little bit about the street that our museum is on as well. So that's Henrietta Street, and you can see it there on the map of Dublin. Up on the left, the empty fields there, which would eventually become the King's Inn. So it's the oldest Georgian street in Dublin, and probably named after the Lord Lieutenant Charles Fitzroy. He was the second Duke of Grafton, and his wife was Henrietta. And it was constructed on land, started in the mid-1720s on land owned by Luke Gardner. So the Gardner estates were all over this area. And the original use of the street was for townhouses, for the gentry, the Irish gentry attending the Parliament on College Green. The street was home to members of the Irish gentry, including this gentleman here. He's Richard, 3rd Viscount Molesworth, and that's where Molesworth Street is named after here. And it was popularly referred to in the area as Primate's Hill, as one of the houses was owned by Hugh Boulter, the Church of Ireland Archbishop of Armagh and Primate of all Ireland. And he said he lived here in popish splendour. Other famous residents include Nathaniel Clements, who constructed 3 houses on the street, was a friend of Luke Gardner's, but he also constructed the Viceregal Lodge up in the Phoenix Park, and that's now Áras an Uachtaráin. He actually said he lived here in Parisian splendor, so you can imagine how the street looked back then. So after the Act of Union in 1801, this street slowly falls into disrepair. During the latter part of the 19th century, the houses became tenements. So while the houses on Henrietta Street had originally been constructed to house a small number of very wealthy Anglo-Irish families. For example, Molesworth's household was 4 people, himself, his wife, and 2 daughters. By 1911, we know from the census that there were 835 people living in the 15 houses of Henrietta Street, most of them in extreme poverty. So that's nearly 60 people per house. And a number of the houses on Henrietta Street remained as tenements right up to the 1980s. And in other parts of Dublin as well. So Thomas Bryan had family living on Henrietta Street in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and we believe it's possible that he lived there himself. So Thomas Bryan, we don't know a lot about him, but up to his arrest and his execution, but we can piece together bits from his birth and marriage records, also from his prison records, state pension records and things like that. And we do have a small amount of photographs of Bryan and his family that we can look at. So photos were very expensive back then. So it was a big outlay to get a photograph of yourself. So people tended just to get a photograph done for, very big occasions, birth, marriage, death, things like that. So Thomas was born in Dublin in 1897 to James and Mary Bryan, and he grew up in the inner city. He was an electrician by trade, which was an excellent job for a boy in the tenements. And his parents later claimed that they had incurred great expense giving their son a trade. Trades were like gold dust in Dublin at the time, and to get your son a trade was very important, and it was a way out of the poverty of the tenements. And so after the 1916 Rising, hundreds of Irish volunteers were transferred to prison in England. But remarkably, by Christmas 1916, most of them had been released and returned to Dublin. So in the period after the execution of the leaders of the 1916 rebellion, Irish public opinion swung very strongly behind the rebels. And the prisoners then returned as heroes. And these events and all the other events at that time probably radicalized many young men at the time, including Thomas Bryan. And he went out and he joined the Irish Volunteers and probably headed down to Thomas Fallon's on Mary Street to kit himself out in an Irish Volunteers uniform, as you can see there. And it's everything from haversacks to sword scabbards and everything like that. So you could get yourself well kitted out as a volunteer. The only slight problem you probably had was getting yourself a weapon of some description. That was slightly more difficult. So Thomas joins the Volunteers, and the next we hear about him is his name appears down in the Register of Prisoners in Mountjoy Gaol. That's the page out of the register where he's mentioned on. So he's arrested on the 9th of November 1917, age 20, and charged with having, and I quote, acted in contravention of Regulation 9E of the Defence of the Realm regulation by taking part in a certain drill of a military nature. So these were all the volunteer marches that were taking place at the time. While he was in Mountjoy Gaol, he took part in a hunger strike. And that was the same hunger strike that Thomas Ashe, who was a founding member of the Irish Volunteers, Thomas Ashe died in that hunger strike. And Bryan and some of the other volunteers were then transferred out of Dublin up to Dundalk Jail. And then he was released from Dundalk Jail. The next we hear about him then is 3 years after his arrest, and he marries Annie Glynn, and there's their wedding photograph there. He marries her on the 9th of November 1920 in St. Mickens Church, and that's the Mickens in Halston Street, not the one up by Christchurch. So the St. Mickens in North Inner City Dublin, round the corner from Henrietta Street. Annie's father, Thomas, had served in the British Army in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, but had died quite young. Again, very common for tenement families to have people serving in the British Army at the time. So Mary, his wife, so Thomas's wife, the original Thomas. She later married his brother Richard after Thomas had died. And we can only speculate what Annie's family thought of the hot-headed young Republican Thomas Bryan coming into that family. But it would have been common enough to have people from a Republican background and a British Army background in Dublin at the time under the same roof. So Annie was actually pregnant by the time of Thomas's execution on the 14th of March 1921. There's quite a short period there between the marriage and his actual execution, so 14th of March 1921. But the baby called Thomas sadly died just 3 or 4 days previous to Thomas's execution. And we see that's their marriage certificate there. So Thomas Bryan and Annie Glynn. And you can see, you notice that the spelling of his name is slightly different from the spelling we're using, but that again would have been very common at the time with people taking their names from Gaelic and Irish into English and back again, back and forth. So Thomas seems to have been a good husband, because we hear from Annie at a later date that while he was alive, he handed over his entire week's wages to her, and I quote, with the exception of a few shillings that he kept for cigarettes, etc. So we know he's a good husband. So another thing that ties us in to Henrietta Street and the Forgotten Ten is Thomas Barry, because in 1920 there was an IRA raid on the King's Inns at the top of Henrietta Street. So in the brief raid, the IRA took the garrison prisoner and escaped with 25 rifles, ammunition, hand grenades, and they also captured 2 Lewis guns. And one of those Lewis guns was carried off, Lewis machine guns was carried off by Kevin Barry. So we have a report of the raid, and it makes for quite exciting reading. So it says at 3:50 on Tuesday the 1st, the operation began, and by 3:58 it was all over. The squads entering from Constitution Hill came in and locked the front gates, while the Henrietta Street squad entered the side door of the building with Jerry Golden, well known to the British soldiers as a striking law clerk, ostensibly playing the role of a prisoner held at gunpoint by the IRA. They entered the guardroom, catching the occupants by surprise, and held them up against the wall at gunpoint, while they made off with 25 rifles, several thousand rounds of ammunition, and some boxes of hand grenades. The main prize, however, was 2 large Lewis machine guns, one of them carried out of the building by an ecstatic 18-year-old Kevin Barry. So that's great. You get a real impression of Kevin Barry coming out of there with his Lewis machine gun slung over his shoulder. So there's the King's Inns, as you can see, up the top of Henrietta Street. So Kevin Barry was tried and executed for his part on the raid on the British Army outside a bakery on Church Street on September the 20th, 1920, in which a soldier was killed. Barry was the first Irishman to have been executed since the rebellion of 1916. And you can see from his photograph, he was a student, a university student, very, very young, very good looking. And this execution reverberated around the world. And Thomas Bryan would have been well aware of this raid on Henrietta Street and on Barry's execution, you know, as he had family connections, you know, in the area. And then he would have ended up, as I said, being buried in the same unmarked plot in Mountjoy Gaol as Barry. So the next we hear of Thomas Bryan is, there he is actually there in his, that's Thomas standing there in his volunteer uniform. I'm not sure who the gentleman sitting down is. We haven't any record of that. So the Tolka Bridge raid. So this is the next we hear of Thomas Bryan. So on Friday, the 21st of January, 1921, a group of volunteers from the 1st IRA Battalion took part in an ambush on a black and tan. That's the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary Auxiliaries. They hated black and tans. So a patrol returning to Dublin at Binns Bridge over the Royal Canal on the lower Drumcondra Road. They were returning from their base in Gormanstown near Drogheda. The RIC seemed to have had a tip-off about the raid and quickly arrived in numbers. As the volunteers fled into the fields, so Drumcondra was open fields at the time, they were pursued and shot at, with one of them being killed. 2 men escaped and the rest were arrested and sentenced to death, including Dermot O'Sullivan, who was reprieved, and he was reprieved because he was only 17 years of age at the time of his capture. The following men, all under the age of 30, took part in the raid, and they were Lieutenant Frank Flood, He led the ambush, and he was accompanied by Mick McGee, Patrick Doyle, Sean Burke, Thomas Bryan, Bertie Ryan, and Dermot O'Sullivan. When the volunteers realised that the auxiliaries would not be arriving due to being tipped off, they moved from Binsbridge up to the Talca Bridge, so they moved up the road a bit. The volunteers began their ambush when 2 lorry loads of RIC constables arrived from the other direction, but they were able to reverse their vehicles out of range. In the meantime, Black and Tans had arrived in trucks and an armoured car, and they cut off the volunteers from the rear. So they were in a pincer movement at the bridge there. The volunteers were now able to scatter across the fields, open fields and suburban gardens and allotments. Subsequently, they were all arrested and found to be in possession of guns and ammunition, and Frank Flood was found to have a grenade on him. During the escape attempt, Sean Burke and Mick McGee were apprehended fleeing across garden allotments in Clonturk Park. McGee was shot and died afterwards. He was the only casualty on the volunteer side, and there were no RIC casualties. So Dermot O'Sullivan, as I said, was spared execution due to his young age, and that gave him an opportunity. He was to give his side of the story to the Bureau of Military History, and we'll have a little listen to that. So there's Drumcondra Bridge there, looking back into the city at the time. So we have here Dermot O'Sullivan's volunteer Bureau of Military History statement on the raid. And he says, on the 21st of January 1921, number 1 section was detailed to take up positions at Binsbridge, Drumcondra at 8:30 a.m. and ambush a party of Black and Tans, which usually came into the city at this time from Gormanstown. The section commander's instructions for the attack on the Tan lorry were that the lorry was to be allowed to pass through our first pair of men, and then when it came in line with the pair located at the north side of Binsbridge, they were to open fire on it. We were all to fire simultaneously, likewise when it came abreast of our position. The entire section remained in position until 9:30, and as no Tan lorry came our way within that time, the section commander decided to withdraw to a further position down the Drumcondra Road in the vicinity of Clonturk Park. Almost simultaneously with the arrival of the van, we noticed that an armoured car and a few lorries of military were coming in our direction from the city, and another armoured car and some lorries were also approaching our position from the Whitehall direction. It was clear that someone must have summoned the aid of the military and the Tans, as the place seemed to be surrounded. There was nothing for it but to get out as quickly as we could, so we made our way down Richmond Road in the direction of Ballybock with the intention of cutting across country towards Clontarf. As we reached the junction of Grace Park Road, we saw 2 tenders of Black and Tans approaching from the Ballybock direction. We wheeled up Grace Park Road and into Grace Park Gardens. At the time, Clontarf Park was open country. A Lewis gun, which had opened fire at some of our section crossing Clontarf Park, which was then not a built-up area, could have brought us under fire. In fact, one of our men, McGee, was killed while he was trying to get away. So that's the volunteer account of the ambush. But we have another account, and this is by William King, and he's the district inspector of the RIC, much shorter, so I'll just read it briefly to you. He says, I'm the district inspector of the auxiliary RIC stationed at Dublin Castle at about 10:30 hours on the 21st of January 1921, in consequence of information received, so there's the tip-off, proceeded with a party of cadets along the Drumcondra Road, Dublin. Just before reaching the Talca Bridge, a lorry laden with RIC constables passed me going in the direction of Dublin City. One of the constables shouted a warning to be on our guard. On reaching a low wall bordering some of the allotments opposite St. Patrick's College, I saw 5 men in civilian clothing running away from the main road across the plots. 2 men arose from behind a wall and ran. I heard shots fired, and I immediately fired at the running man who was nearest to me, about 25 yards away. The man fell but got up and ran, whereupon I fired again, as did several of my men. The man fell to the ground and remained there. The wounded man gave me his name as Michael McGee, an address as 20 Osman Road, North Circular Road, and stated that he was the section leader of A Company IRA. So the 2 accounts tie in very closely, so no one is trying to embellish or elaborate their account. They seem to be stating very much the same thing. So there's the bridge there. So only 2 volunteers managed to escape the raid. McGee died of his wounds on the day. The other 5, Flood, Bryan, Ryan and Doyle and O'Sullivan, were all tried by court-martial, convicted of high treason and sentenced to death. So on the 14th of March 1921, they were hanged in Mountjoy Prison. Because of his young age, only 17 at the time, O'Sullivan's death sentence was commuted and he was sentenced to life in prison. He was released from Portland Jail in Great Britain at the end of August 1921. Before he was executed, actually, we just have a quick look at this. That's the evidence, the secret evidence that was given against, we have Thomas Bryan and Frank Flood here, and we see that they had 35 rounds of ammunition, a .45 revolver. Thomas Bryan, 1 revolver and about 20 rounds. Frank Flood, 1 revolver and about 15 rounds, where they were arrested there in Grace Park Road. So before he was executed, Bryan wrote a letter to his father-in-law stating that he was willing to die for Ireland, but lamented it was the women who suffer the most. And there is Thomas Bryan's execution certificate. So instructions for the guidance of courts martial where a sentence of death has passed, and that's the various details there, high treason and his death sentence there. Unusually, Annie Glynn, his wife, was not in attendance outside Mountjoy at the day of her husband's execution. There you can see Barry's execution and the crowds it drew. And it was the same for the Forgotten 10 or the other 9 men. There were big crowds outside Mountjoy praying for them at the time. But Annie Glynn, his wife, wasn't in attendance. And that led to speculation that she had in fact died. And when a reporter from the Evening Herald went to her family home to confirm that her death, he was actually told that she was ill in bed. And she was ill in bed because she had just lost her baby 4 days previous to Thomas's execution. So terrible story. And it would be 80 years before these 10 men were reinterred in Glasnevin Cemetery. So following the War of Independence, Mountjoy Prison was transferred to the control of the Irish Free State that was early in the 1920s. So early in the 1920s, the families of the dead men requested that their remains be returned for reburial. And late in the 1920s, they received support from the National Graves Association. And nothing happened. They were still up in this unidentified plot in Mountjoy Jail. The graves were finally identified by the National Graves Association and marked out in the yard in Mountjoy in 1934, but there was still no further progress. So talks between the families of the 10 and the Irish government dragged on for decades. And finally, in 1996, a Celtic cross was erected in Glasnevin Cemetery to commemorate the men. On the 1st of November, which was the 80th anniversary of Kevin Barry's execution, an announcement was made that the bodies would be reinterred in Glasnevin Cemetery. And on the 14th of October 2001, a private service for the families was held down in Mountjoy Jail Prison, followed by Mass in the Pro-Cathedral and burial in the Republican plot in Glasnevin Cemetery with full military honours. And the state funeral was broadcast live on RTÉ television and radio. In accordance with his family's wishes, Patrick Maher was reinterred separately in Ballylanders in County Limerick, where he came from. Large crowds lined the streets and applauded as the cortege passed through the city, and a lone piper played as they passed the GPO on O'Connell Street, the most important site of the 1916 Rising. There was some criticism in the British press at the time regarding the state funeral and the glorification of IRA violence. But in his homily at the funeral in the Pro-Cathedral, Cardinal Cahill Daly was at pains to point out and to differentiate the difference between the men who had fought under the banner of the IRA in 1916 and the War of Independence and the modern IRA taking part in the conflict of Northern Ireland. That was something the British press obviously had difficulty in trying to figure out which IRA they were actually speaking about. But Cardinal Daly said in his homily, the true inheritors today of the ideals of the men and women of 1916 to 1922 are those who are explicitly and visibly committed to leaving the physical force tradition behind. Surely the state funeral can be an occasion for examination of conscience about the ideals of the men and who died, and about our responsibility for translating these ideas into today's reality. At the graveside oration for the Forgotten Ten, the graveside oration was given by then Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, and he was at pains really to echo the sentiments of Cardinal Daly at the time. And then there was obviously the unveiling of and the renaming of the bridge, the Frank Flood Bridge there. As you can see, that plaque is up on the bridge there as well now. And there, kind of, the story would have ended if it wasn't for some more reports that we have from, of all places, the pension board, because we'll see that Thomas Bryan and his family were still living in the tenements after his execution, and they continued to suffer after his execution. Annie Glynn applied to have his military pension transferred to her, and she was obviously in dire straits, the woman, and it's described in the files of the Pension Bureau as looking, and I quote, frail and delicate looking, a woman who appears to be in poor circumstances. After Thomas Bryan's execution, she lived in poverty in a tenement in Mountjoy Square, and she was dependent on the White Cross organisation at the time for financial assistance and medical treatment. By 1924, we see that she's actually in receipt of a pension of £90 per annum, but sadly she didn't live long enough to enjoy, if that's the word I'm looking for, to enjoy her pension. And she died in 1930, aged 30, of tuberculosis, which was a very, very common ailment in the tenements in Dublin at the time. And the state had to pay for her funeral expenses. She had no money to pay for her funeral expenses. Brian's parents, James and Mary, then claimed dependency for their son, and they were also living in dire circumstances, in terrible tenement conditions, and they're described in the files in 1928 as living in absolutely in want. So another tenement family suffering very badly. James suffered from rheumatism, Mary had bronchitis. They pawned everything they owned bar their bed, so you can imagine what that was like. The family also claimed that they had spent everything they had in supporting their son through his 7-year indentured apprenticeship, and he in return had promised to support them. After persistent lobbying, including by the future President Sean T. O'Kelly, the state gave them a gratuity of £100, but their parents said it wasn't enough to alleviate their sufferings and claimed a further £50. So very, very small sums of money you're talking about back then, and even and today, obviously. Their case was taken up by William T. Cosgrave, so they seem to have had very good connections. But their case was taken up by Cosgrave, but the Department of Defence said they were not convinced that his parents had been wholly dependent on Bryan before his execution. After the parents' death, 2 of the children then in turn tried to claim the pension, which had been given to Annie Glynn, but they were turned down on the basis that the pension was non-transferable. And this goes on because a final entry in the trial, in the files in 1975, shows the state relenting, and finally Bryan's sister Mary is given an allowance of £673 a year. And again, that's kind of at the end of our story, but it did pop up again in a very, very odd place and brought the whole story of Thomas Bryan to the fore again. And that's because it popped up on BBC first and then RTE in an edition of their genealogy programme, Who Do You Think You Are? And the centre of that was Boy George, or George O'Dowd. This was broadcast on July the 25th, 2018, and Boy George is exploring his Irish heritage here. So he's born George O'Dowd to Irish parents in the UK, and he listened to a lot of rebel music when he was growing up. and they knew that their family had connections to the Forgotten Ten. And because of all this rebel music he was growing up, he grew up learning to sing the song Kevin Barry. The family assumed that they were actually related to Kevin Barry. So early in the show, he visits the Tenement Museum in Henrietta Street, number 14 Henrietta Street, trying to understand this period of Dublin history. And he's shown around Mrs. Dowling's flat, that's the flat we looked at earlier, as a recreation of a typical family dwelling. The next day, after further investigation, he discovered that he's not in fact related to Kevin Barry, but is related to Thomas Bryan. And you can see the family tree there, and you can see on the right-hand side Annie Glynn and Thomas Bryan, and you can see Boy George down here in the bottom left. So he's related, it's his great uncle. And Thomas Bryan had been married to Boy George's maternal great-grandmother, Annie Glynn. So on discovering his family's history, very, very interesting episode, Boy George, he declared himself to be proud and sad. And he said that his Irish family's story was like a great Irish song or ballad, a lament. So Thomas Bryan is now buried in the Republican plot in Glasnevin Cemetery. And his story, as I said earlier, is that of an ordinary man from an ordinary family caught up in these extraordinary times. And I think his story is indeed like a great Irish song, a lament. Guramagat.
One question people want to know is, could you explain to them what the White Cross is? You did say that his widow was living dependent on the White Cross for money and for medical. Could you explain what the White Cross is, please?
It's a voluntary organisation, very like the Red Cross, that were involved in kind of remedial works and supporting families in poverty and stuff like that. I don't know a huge amount about it. I know it was an international organisation, and that's all I know. But I'll definitely try and find out. I'm not going to say anymore because I don't know anymore.
Okay. Well, please keep your. We're getting lots of praise for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
But not so many questions. So if people do have questions, please get them into us. I have a question though. In the meantime, am I right in assuming that the monument of the kneeling soldier in uniform on Blackwater Bridge facing Mountjoy Prison, has that some sort of connection to Thomas Bryan and the Forgotten Ten?
I know it's a volunteer. It's a statue for the volunteers. I'm not sure if there's a direct connection between the two. I know the bridge is the Frank Flood or Drogheda Frank Flood now, and that's the monument directly related to the ambush, but I think I'm not 100%. You might know better than I do if it's a more of a general monument to the volunteers.
In the back of my mind that tells me that was to do with Frank Flood, but it's way in the past, so I'm not so sure. So is there anybody else any questions? Or if you want to elaborate on anything yourself,
we were saying it earlier. Most of the volunteers would have been more like, Frank Flood. It's just ordinary people, getting caught up in this thing, and we don't hear about them a lot, the vast majority of the volunteers would have been just ordinary men and women, that stepped up to the mark at the time. We hear, we know a lot about Collins and Pierce and Connolly and all these people, but it's very hard to find. A lot of the volunteers left no photographs behind them, especially the women. Very scanty biographies. We know that from Richmond Barracks. The little, where we looked at a lot of the women volunteers. There's nothing. There's not even, we don't know their addresses.
We have a good question in here now, Colin. It says, where can people find out more about any good books and websites and so on? And well, that's an easy one. I'll take it.
You take that because
I mean, in this decade of centenaries, there has been an immense amount of great information coming in the form of books. One of my own favourite authors is Patrick Yates, who's written a series of books, The City in Turmoil, City in Wartime. He does 5 books, I think, that start with the 1913 lockout, go through the Rising, onto the War of Independence, onto the Civil War. So there are loads and loads of books out there, loads. And the other great source, and I see, Colin, you used it very effectively tonight, a great source of information here is the Bureau of Military History website. All you need to do, if you have the name of a relation who you think might have been involved, go onto the search engine and you'd be amazed what you'll find out.
Can I give you another one here, Fergus? And I discovered it recently, and it is absolutely fantastic. It's Michael Laffan, the professor in UCD. He recorded his whole university series of university lectures as a podcast and gave them to the public. And it's his university lectures on the War of pre-1916, 1916, and the War of Independence. And as I said, it's his first year lectures that he used to give to the history students in UCD. And it's on historyhub.ie, The Irish Revolution by Professor Michael Laffan. It is absolutely, would blow you away.
Can I just make a technical point here for people too? I've had some comments about the chat been disabled. If you want to make a point, make it through the Q&A. The chat isn't available in this particular format. So we have a couple more minutes left. So if anybody else has any further questions, we don't need any more congratulations, although I suppose
thank you. They'll keep them coming.
I think it's obviously very gratifying for Colin to get them. But anybody else, any last questions before we wrap it up?
Hang on, there's someone there. Thanks. Just come back to Boy George. Was Annie Glynn his granny's sister? Annie Glynn, yes, I think so. Yeah, that was the connection there. It was his auntie, great auntie, or great grand auntie. Is that? I'm not sure about how that works, but yeah, it was his sister.
And
and were they the last
question there, Patricia O'Donovan? Were these the last executions? I think so.
I know Barry's was the first since 1916, and I think they might have been the last before.
I think they were, because they were executed in March and the truce comes around in June. So certainly they were amongst the very last. And it really is, I often make the point when I'm talking about them that they were very, very, very unlucky. That had it been just a couple of weeks one way or the other.
Yeah.
As a fella says, they might be alive today, hardly, but they were unfortunate.
But they were very young. I mean, as I said, they were all under 30. That's for sure. But when I say all under 30, one or two of them were 27, 28. The rest of them were barely 20, 21, 22. They're very, very young bunch of men.
Okay. Well, look, Colin, I think. We'll leave it there. I'd like to thank you, Colin, for giving us a great talk, and I'd like to thank all of you who came here to listen. And I hope to see you. I put the link for the newsletter into the chat there, so get in touch and keep informed about future events. Our next Teatime Talk will be entitled "Bang Bang Shoots the Buses: Thomas Dudley and His Legacy." This is, of course, about the great Dublin street character, Bang Bang. It'll be on the 24th of March at 7 p.m. Donald Fallon in conversation with Daniel Lambert. If you want to book your free ticket, just go on to 14 Henrietta Street .ie. Thanks again for being with us tonight, and thank you again, Colin. And we hope to see you all at future events. Thank you very much for your time.